Alyssa, I'm not sure how the meeting's going to go, but I'm prepared. Tell Sean.
All right, folks, we'll be starting in just a moment, so if you can find your seats, find your power. We heartily recommend you stay on this side of the black line for two reasons. One, if you will notice, all of the AV equipment is pointing this way, so you will actually hear if you stand on that side. Second, all the people on the other side are going to be required to pay for the black wall between the two of them. We're not quite sure how we're going to get the money from them, but we are sure which side is going to have to pay. So we encourage you to be on this side. Thank you very much. Do you want to talk while I run, or do you want to? Yeah, always just run. Okay.
All right, well, this is the Rtcweb working group. If you think you're supposed to be someplace else, it's probably a good time to leave. Next slide. This is the high-level overview of what's going on. It's us, we're the chairs. I'm Sean, that's Ted, it's Colin behind me. Alyssa Cooper is our illustrious AD in the front row. We got some meet echo going on. We might have some remote participants, and if you're presenting, make sure to stand in a pink box. We have a red button just for you. We have an XMPB back channel. We need a Jabber scribe. We have a Jabber scribe, excellent. And we also have a minute taker. Thank you very much, sir. Yay.
We also thank the people who provided the bribe for the minute taker.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Matt and Sean.
Matt and Sean, thanks for the bribe. Everyone who's provided comments on the list, GitHub issues, etc. Thank you very much. I guess the next thing we need to do is thank Barry, who is our outgoing area, one of our outgoing art area directors. I do not see him here. He's not going to come. Well, we're going to give him a beer the next time we see him. So, all right.
Unless we drink his beer.
Unless we drink it. This is the Note Well. You should have all seen this by now. Note it well. Read it. There's a bunch of links in there about the things that you need to do. The gist is that things are going to be recorded, both audio and visual. So make sure if you've got a statement that you understand what's going on. And if you don't want to follow this, you need to go. Next. And here's our agenda. I actually uploaded a new version that's got some links into the drafts that are actually related to each of these. But basically, we've got 2 days And today we're going to kind of go through these, and then on Friday is the remaining part of JSON. So we're going to go through some working group status, we do some FEC, and then we do some IP address handling, and if we have time permitting, we're going to do a SDP and DTLS. Yeah.
Is there any agenda bashing?
Last point. Would you mind doing DTLS and SDP instead of the other way around?
Sorry.
I know we stack everything over everything, but
I think it's correct in the agenda on the actually uploaded in the data tracker. Yeah, sure, I can run through these. So I'm mostly focused on the ones here that are, not already passed, that are out of the working group. So ALPN's moving along. Audio is, I think, largely only hung up on perhaps this remaining DTMF questions.
We thought you were going to the mic. No, you are going
No, it's fine. Alyssa Cooper. So on ALPN, I sent comments in my AD review, but I don't believe I received a response. So it's not moving along fine.
So the latest was that I missed the deadline, and you said, yes, those changes look fine. Please submit the next version of the draft when you get the opportunity. I haven't had the opportunity. I will do that right now. How does that sound?
Great.
And then we can just move along.
Okay. Also, there's a couple of your documents are in a publication requested state for more than a year. I think they are above the ones that you're looking at now in the data tracker, so you might want to go over those as well. Or they're somewhere in the data tracker, so don't skip the ones that are in that state, please.
Do you want to do this off on my draft? Okay. Okay. We might have to come back to those in a second. Audio codecs. Data channel, one of the many ones that's in the RFC editor queue with missing references for 453 days. I have a draft that's not meant to be an RFC, I think it's just a draft Jennings depths or something where you can see all the dependencies and interdependencies of the drafts. Much of our stuff falls back to being blocked on all of it being done at once at a certain degree. So I forget which ones exactly the data channel's blocked on. It may be the security, which is blocked on the other ones, but there's a bunch of documents that are just blocked on references, and we'll probably continue that way until until the ICE drafts, including the ICE trickle drafts, complete, and until the JSON draft completes. Which if you see those authors, tell them to hurry up.
These are the ones you wanted us to cover? These are the ones?
Yeah. Okay.
Just
Do we want to talk about? We talked about the security thing last time, right?
so just on the data channel, can I? Yeah, Christian Gross. With regards to the data channel draft, I think it falls down to the SCTP end data as being one of the critical drafts, and according to the TSV session, prior to this, that should be going to working group last call in a couple of weeks. So hopefully we get some movement on that.
Okay.
So the security drafts, if you remember last time, we did kind of like a blitzkrieg through the outstanding comments. And basically, it's trying to get some very busy people's time to do some updates. I guess when I talked with them last, they basically said, we're like 98% of the way there. We're going to do a couple of tweaks. We're not going to rewrite the entire draft based on comments from, I guess, the apps area. So, or what was it?
There was still an apps area.
Yeah. So, Ecker.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm a bad person and I should have worked on this harder. That said, I'm not going to. So at least not probably for several months. So if someone, I mean, the amount of work that has to be done is relatively modest, but it's also, I just don't have time for it right now. So if someone would like to volunteer to like help with clearing up some of the last open issues, that'd be helpful. Other than that, it'll be like sometime around Berlin.
Okay, we're looking for volunteers now.
I have an idea. He bribed us earlier. So Sean, have you got free time to do this?
It sounded like, yeah.
That sounded like a yes. Oh, excellent. Let's put that in the minutes that Sean Cooley is going to look at this 2 security drafts. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Make sure there's a spelling error on that look.
Oh, so while you're mucking around, Martin Thompson, Fluffy asked me to have a look at some of the identity sections of these documents, and I did, and unfortunately I'm too close to all of that, and I'm unable to see any of the problems that I would expect, that are no doubt there, yes. So I need help on that as well, so. I'm sure that Sean will do an excellent job. I think that if we can find someone else to step up, that would be great too.
So Ian, I noticed that you arrived late and weren't paying attention just then. Would you care to volunteer? Maybe. Yeah. Basically, you need to go find Martin, ask Martin what sections of a particular draft that talk about identity need review by somebody who hasn't looked at it a lot. I think you qualify. Would you be interested? Sure. Okay. Write Ian's name down as another pressed into service, possibly not actual volunteer. Thank you very much. Usage. Okay. So, yeah. This is claiming to be in misref. It's actually in yet another last call. So, sorry, disambiguating, that would be RTP usage. Interestingly enough, the state tracker doesn't have a please stop bothering me state. But if it did, surely we would be the highest user of it among current art working groups. But this went back into a last call after a small number of editorial and not so editorial changes. So it's in working group / IETF last call. So far, everything's going swimmingly, and we certainly expect it to continue so, at which point it will return to its current state.
Just looking at the dependency on, worth noting, it depends reference-wise on RTP multi-stream and multi-stream optimization.
So Magnus Westlund, author of the multi-stream and multi-stream optimization. Which documents are in the RFC editors queue and is dependent on bundle? That's why they're not published. So.
Okay, so that sounds good. Okay, so are we done with this? Do we have any more? Those are the main ones? Okay. I mean, just as a point of sort of, I mean, like, look, you see all this stuff that's not done, but just in a point of the stuff that has gotten done. When you go and like look at I mean, in the list of drafts we've been tracking as part of this working group, we're up to 20 published RFCs, and not directly from this working group, but of the WebRTC work as a whole. We're in a bunch that are at past last call, like probably over half, another 20 maybe, and another, 10 or so that are not yet at working group last call. So I mean, we're closing in on the end here, okay? We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Oncoming train. So, Justin.
Okay, it should be brief here. I managed to misspell or misarrange the words on the slide title of the actual draft name. Yep. Right, so don't look for that document name. Anyway, next. So Magnus gave this a very thorough review. Thanks very much. Fixed basically the things he found, as well as some of the remaining to-dos in the document. Of those, one of the things that was missing was actually what the overhead is of using FEC, the internal Opus FEC. We found that was about 20 to 30%, which is actually much better than some of the other possible mechanisms. So it's noted in the document. Also mentioned some of the limitations of the Opus built-in FEC, mainly that you can only protect the previous audio frame. You can't do multi-packet FEC with the built-in Opus FEC. So if you want to do that, you roll it back to RFC 2198 style FEC. Also, Magnus asked for discussion of AMR, MAR, or wideband because those are things in the recommended audio codecs for interop document, which is a working group document. So those are now covered, as well as the various spec mechanisms that exist for AMR. And also, now that we have FlexSpec, which doesn't require the SSRC to be indicated in SDP, since it's indicated within the actual payload, we no longer need to include discussion of SSRC group and A equals SSRC attributes in this document. And it describes how FlexSpec can be used for the demultiplexing. Next. So, open issues. Really, there are very few. The one that still remains in the document is what, if anything, do we need to say about signaling support for FEC in AMR wideband or AMR? There are a bunch of various attributes that are defined in the AMR document, but there doesn't seem to be anything that is like an on-off switch that's similar to Opus's use in band FEC. So I wanted to sort of get people who know more about AMR to comment on this.
So, Magnus Westland. Yeah, I mean, the reason why it doesn't include any signaling is that the receiver side support that is kind of mandatory and implicit, so that you have support to accept it. So the sender can always choose to use it towards the receiver.
Excellent. Okay. Well, if that's the case, that it's mandatory to implement, then like no, we don't need any text here, which is what I was hoping. There's also this max read parameter in AMR, which allows you to indicate like what's the maximum depth of effect that you should support. That seems like that could be arbitrary. We don't need to make any statement here in this document, so I recommend just not saying anything. Do you agree? Okay. So we will not say anything about the what needs to be signaled to indicate you can in fact receive AMR wideband FEC, and we won't say anything about max read either. So with that, I will basically strike that last to do, and I believe the document will be ready for last call. Just to be clear, like Magnus is the only person who has reviewed the document in detail. So if we want to have additional reviews before last call, I guess we could call for that as well.
So, Justin.
Yes.
So about max read, I mean, that after all, in some sense, for IMAR can actually indicate that you wouldn't like to receive any redundancy at all. So, but it's a negotiation factor. So, how much you use it for? So,
sorry. I mean, so are you saying like the offerer needs to consider the case where it receives max read equals 0, or are you saying that the offerer should also indicate some max read?
good question. I mean, I think it's the receiver. It's just receiver based. I have to go review it again about how it actually looks. So, but it's you can take it afterwards. You might be right that it might be something different to set there. I need to think about it.
I mean, the document says, for AMR, says that if no value is applied, basically it's a sender's discretion.
Yeah.
And that really feels like that's the appropriate thing. I mean, we could have some note saying that if you receive a value of 0 for max red, then don't send FEC. But that's already kind of redundant in some ways. So if you want to investigate and report back.
I need to look into it. I think the max red parameters actually, especially in like interoperability case towards 3GPP, MTSI systems, etc., it might actually use this parameter.
Okay. So Mark, you would then change that to indicate that Magnus will go investigate this and let us know what we should do.
So clearly it would be nice to have a couple of focused reviews of this before we take it to working group last call. Staring out into the number of people who are staring at their screens, I'm thinking, Tim, could we ask you to do it? Sure. Okay, so Tim, Mo, and Mo. One more who Mo's
and Abby.
Anybody else want to actually raise their hand and not force me to call upon you? Oh, come on now.
Very short document.
Really tiny. All right. Thank you.
Hey, Justin, can you say anything about implementation status of that? Have you guys implemented?
So we support the Opus M-band FEC, and we don't support the flex FEC yet. So we support the recommended modes for audio for Opus basically, and that's really about it.
So we got one more volunteer from the Jabber room, Varun. Thank you very much for Varun Singh.
Could we return back to the beginning of this presentation?
Oh, sure, just a second. I wanted to remind those of you who are on the left side of the room from our point of view that you have put yourself into the dead zone from the point of view of where all of the speakers are pointing. We also would like to let you know, because you're on the opposite side, you will have to pay for the wall between yourselves and the people on the right side. We apologize.
Okay, on from FEC on to handling of IP addresses. This time I actually got the document name right. Next. Okay, so for those of you reading email, when we discussed in Yokohama, this is the overall goal we were trying to achieve with this document. There were a bunch of different goals that we were trying to sort out the priority of, but the main thing is to prevent web pages from drive-by gathering addresses and using it for identifying if you were on a VPN. We also had a very strong sort of goal to make sure that, at least when this is on by default, it didn't degrade actual performance in actual real-world cases. And we actually rolled this out by default in Chrome recently and found that it did not, in fact, degrade performance, which was great. And also give users control that if they didn't like the defaults and needed additional privacy, behavior, there was well-defined ways of which that they could actually do that. Next. So this is what we came up with as a solution space. Basically 4 different modes, and modes 1 and 2 are set as the default, and those are predicated based on whether the actual application has received permission from the user. And then modes 3 and 4 could be optionally enabled by the user if they want additional control over which IP addresses are disclosed. Next. So since Yokohama received a detailed review from Adam and Wendy, Wendy especially from the privacy perspective, and overall very positive reviews. Adam had a lot of text and other good suggestions that were now incorporated into this most recent document. In particular, probably the most substantial change, and I'll talk about this in detail later, was the part where we talk about why we couple network permission with camera and mic permission. It was a little hand wavy before. Now, thanks to Adam, it's you know, a more robust argument, and I'll talk about that in a future slide. Also, discussion of whether we have proxies that aren't TCP proxies, and I'll talk about that in more detail later as well. Added a bunch of references, and then a number of editorial things that Adam turned up. Next. Okay, so I'll let you read this for a little bit. The main thing is the old text basically made a bit of a hand-wavy thing about how you know, access to the actual video camera information is more sensitive than the IP address information, and therefore, you know, this coupling, you know, therefore should follow directly from that. The new text basically explains a bit more of like how we arrived here, namely that, you know, this is a very difficult thing to kind of explain to users, and that we found, like, you know, after considering all the possibilities, this actually made the most sense. And the folks in the ping working group thought this made a lot of sense as well. Anybody objects with this, now will be the time to speak.
So just to be clear, this is exactly the same functional thing, just with different explanatory justifications.
Yes, it is. Perhaps the one slightly salient point here would be the fact that perhaps like it gives some advice to user agents that they actually should indicate they are going to, in the prompt for asking for permissions, mention the IP gathering stuff. So I think that's spelled out. Yes, in the second sentence that we say the permission grant should, you know, probably also make mention of this. But it is worded sort of carefully enough that it gives a fair amount of discretion.
Right. So Colin Jennings, so as an individual, this may be a W3C issue or even a non-standards issue, a UI type issue, but since all of these need to get a sort of accessible privacy thing, I just want to sort of say, I mean, I'll be interested to see how this is all phrased, but if it's like it is right now, where somebody asks to use my video camera, and then that grants something that people thinks reveals a lot about my location, I just don't think the argument that your video camera is more sensitive than your location, therefore if you got permission for the video camera, you'd get permission for the location. I don't buy that argument. If the grant is for video and location and microphone all combined in one, yes, no objection to that type of idea at all. But I think that we need to somehow make sure that the permission being granted relates to the attack that is changed by whether that grant is permitted or not. So.
Right. So I think that the new text should address exactly that concern. It's not very prescriptive in how exactly a user agent should do that, and I think that's more of a W3C matter perhaps, but I think it captures exactly the sentiment you're expressing, which is that, yes, that coupling is not clear, and that should be sort of handled by the actual user agent, right? You know, and as far as, you know, indicating that to the user somehow.
Right. I just don't want somebody who thinks they put a piece of tape over their camera to think they can automatically hit OK to this with no impact to them. Right. And that's a question about what the text of the prompt says, which I agree is not something this draft should specify. But so maybe it does. But
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Martin Thompson. I'm not sure. I don't know a better solution than what you have written down here either, but I'm not sure that we're able to put that information in a prompt.
Right.
Which leads me to ask the question, do you think that you can?
So I think this is where like we need to kind of probably do a little research, you know, and like what would we what would people actually understand? Like certainly saying, do you trust foo.com to access your microphone, camera, and enumerate all your network interfaces attached to your computer is probably not the right prompt.
Right. And oh, by the way, enumerate all the devices that you have attached, all the audio video devices you have attached, which happen to include your speakers and other output devices. Yes.
Alyssa Cooper, as an individual, I think it's like such a slippery slope to start talking about this in this draft because I mean, the other way you could read this is actually not that anything would change about the prompt at all. It's just that, you know, what this is saying is that implicitly, when you accept a prompt that asks you about the camera and microphone, most people are willing to accept the addition of their local addresses as well.
Right. Well, I don't.
I don't actually see the words here that say this will appear in the prompt. That's,
No intention.
That's what I said.
okay. So I guess the real issue that I have is that there are certainly cases where that's not true at all, right? Like where you're totally fine sharing your video and you're not totally fine sharing your location. And so if you're going to go down the path of talking about this, then you also need to talk about that. And that's unpleasant because we don't want to talk about all these different cases when we have nothing to do about them really. But you don't want to give the false impression that that's not a real case, because it is a real case.
Sorry, I mean, the document does sort of consider, the whole purpose of this document is to basically consider these cases. So like, I think the document does, you know, at least try to consider, you know, the balance that's trying to be, you know, eked out here of, you know, how we can sort of have something that is easier understandable and also provide the privacy protection that we desire. You know, it's not trying to be super prescriptive on exactly what UI is put in front of the user, because I think that's really outside, like, you know, the scope of this group. But as far as like making it clear that it's not, like certainly I think the new text is better than the old text. And, you know, perhaps there are some things in the new text we would want to consider, you know, wordsmith some more. But I think it does try to sort of explain that, yes, it is not a simple thing of like, yes, if you're going to give video, that definitely means that it's okay to give, you know, your network information. And, you know, we could sort of litigate exactly what does expanding the consent to include the network permission agreement exactly mean. But I don't think we can be super prescriptive at this line.
So would you be okay with saying explicitly include? I think the problem that people are having is that it is an implicit inclusion in some of these cases, and that as a result of which they don't believe people understand what's being consented to. If it said explicit, would you be okay, and would they be okay?
What do you, I don't understand your proposal.
If we said here that this permission grant be expanded to explicitly include consent to allow WebRTC2, so that the consent change from camera and microphone to camera, microphone, network location was an explicit part of the consent. However, that's presented in the UI, that's outside of our thing. Would that change your opinion of where we are?
But I thought the whole point is that it's not explicit, and that everybody agrees that there's no good way to explain this, so it won't be made explicit.
Then I don't understand what proposal you're making, because I thought you were proposing that it be made explicit.
I am not proposing that. What I'm proposing is that I think I'm in the realm of the wordsmithing to make it clear that this is one case, and that it's maybe even not even the general case. I don't know.
When you say one case versus the general case, like what do you have specifically in mind?
The case where I'm okay sharing my video and not my location.
Right. So like, and one of the ways that we've tried to approach this is by having the other modes that people who knowingly are in those cases could use to have that specific control of like that no information that would perhaps be location sensitive would ever be given out. But whether that could be done, like whether that can be intimated in a prompt, I think is really like an unresolved question.
Yeah, probably not, I guess.
I mean, I think my view of this just is, this is a tool that fits into a bigger system. And the only thing that we can really evaluate is whether the privacy characteristics of the whole system. So, you know, I think whether I support this as is or not depends on what the rest of the system looks like. And we're going to need to evolve that along a little bit and see it. But if it's a system where no sane user would think there was any location thing here or there, then I don't think we're protecting anything, and this solution isn't appropriate. Because either you don't care about protecting anything, in which case it should just be a different mode, or you do care about protecting it, in which case this fails to protect it. So I'm just sort of flagging that as we see how the whole solution, I mean, I think the draft and the text and the modes 3 and 4 and the fact that browsers are providing APIs for things that definitely know they want to be in a certain mode, like Tor browser or Tor button, are great. But whether for the default mainstream privacy, whether this works or not, is hard to say without understanding what the prompt's going to look like and the rest of the pieces.
Right. I just feel like it's outside the remit of this working group to be designing UI for browsers. So.
Totally. But evaluating whether this works or not to meet the privacy requirements of IETF is within the context of the system it's going to be used in, which includes that. That's all I'm saying. It's hard. I'm not saying we should design the prompt at all. Sure. I'm saying we need to understand that prompt a little bit. If the prompts, what that prompt looked like would greatly influence this discussion.
Harald Alvestron, speaking to the separation of concerns idea. I believe that that the discussion of what advice to give to UI implementers is an area which the W3C has, how to say it, given a lot of thought to, and has generally come down on saying, no, you can't dictate to what the UI should be. You have to write advice on what you want the UI to accomplish. And I think that point one, we should heed that and say what we want to accomplish rather than what the UI should look like. And point two, the details of the one level detail down should be in the W3C documents, not in the IETF documents.
I'm frankly a little surprised we're having this discussion. So, 6 months ago, we were like all totally cool with just like exfiltrating all this data to any piece of JavaScript on the web. And so we're now discussing the conditions under which we will not exfiltrate, also at the same data, which we were totally cool with 6 months ago, like exactly what level of informed user consent we want the user to give. Similarly, when we discussed this last time, I think there was an uneasy agreement that users were not really willing to respond to more than one prompt, and that no sane person could possibly have explained to them, like, this is going to reveal their IP address in some prompt and make any sense of it. I mean, it's perfectly fine if there's some question mark that they click to, and then along with like the doesn't create a bailment and advising liability, it also says it reveals your IP address. But like, it's clearly not going to go in the front end. So maybe people have some material objection to one of those two statements and think that the system should behave differently. If so, then great. If the issue is that the rationale that just happens to come up here for why this quite yucky, but nevertheless, I think a reasonable compromise has been reached, that's like really quite different. And if that's the objection, then I suggest we simply remove this text entirely and say, we recommend that, I mean, I use text is fine, by the way, just to be clear, but if rather than relitigate it for the next hour, I suggest we simply remove this text entirely and say, you know, browsers are encouraged to obtain some method of user consent at their discretion before moving into mode 3 or 4, whatever it is. I will say that basically, from my perspective, whether that consent is informed or not, any dialogue whatsoever has a very substantial deterrent effect on the drive-by case that we're most concerned with here. So I think rat-holing on whether the user knows exactly what's going on when there's no hope of actually explaining what's going on is just really quite silly.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, in terms of material effect on privacy, that dialogue is going to do far more than anything else that we have here. I was going to suggest exactly the same thing. Perhaps this is far too much detail and far too specific. Now, it may be that Cullen wants to have us have this level of specificity so that we can perform the analysis that he's looking to perform. But I don't need to see that. I would just like to see this say, we need some sort of signal from the user that this is not a drive-by situation. And one of those potential signals is the fact that they've given access to camera and microphone. Or even geolocation if it comes to that, because honestly, I see that as far better correlated with the IP address thing than something like camera and microphone.
I actually thought about that, but I thought that, like, I can't imagine a communications app really asking for location in a way that the user can really.
No, that's not the point I'm making.
Okay.
The point is that the browser has received some signal from the user that this is not, this is an exceptional website in the sense that, you know, in this case, you've given them access to camera and microphone. That is an extraordinarily exceptional thing.
Sure, right.
On the web. And so that is a signal that the browser can choose to interpret as saying, well maybe these guys can get a little bit more than the default.
Right, and so that was the overall driving force here. And I think that the problem we're having is that since that covers like 99% of the overall sort of intent, you know, there's like ever the case where at the 1% where someone says, oh, well, I want to use this app, but I don't want to give out my location information. And like, you know, I'm not sure that will ever be a problem we can perfectly resolve. You know, although we do have the other modes, which is the intent of this document. Adam.
So Adam Roach, the horse was not dead when I got up to beat it, but there is one, I think the second sentence here actually does go as far as the IETF really has in its remit. I think that, you know, saying that we're going to have a combined grant is all we really need, and then the specification of how that grant is presented is something that's more W3 and implementation. And I think this gives enough of a hole to throw it over the wall to W3 and have the final bits ironed out there.
Mosinati. So I'm not really seeing how difficult this is, because if I look at today, I pop up a Firefox page and start WebRTC. It gives me, you know, do you consent to share your microphone, and it tells me a drop down of what microphones are available, the camera, and a drop down of what cameras are available. Why couldn't the third bullet be network addresses, a drop down all or only primary? It seems so simple. And even if you don't allow selection or explicit consent to be combined, at least having notification that when you're sharing these things, you will also share your network address. That seems to me to be a simple thing that most users would understand, and it's not rocket science for users to figure out what they're doing. What are you going to fix it to?
I mean, just to that, I think the cognitive load imposed by such a dialogue is pretty scary.
Ted Hardy, individual and no doubt heavily cognitively loaded. Sorry about that. So I disagree pretty strongly with Martin Thompson's characterization of this, and I think I agree far more strongly with Ecker's. And I think the problem with this isn't that we're, you know, desperate to go and give people UI clue, because we don't have it to spare. Truly, I don't think that's it. What we're trying to say here is that in both this one and that one, you're making a parallelism that says the permissions grant for camera and microphone is related to the permissions grant for the IP addresses which are not going to be used, and the information which therefore leaks about you. And that is actually not related. The attempt in the left-hand side to say they're much more sensitive, that I think you're very right to focus on other things and to try and expand it, but I think Ecker is right that ultimately you'd be better off without any of that. And simply to say, hey, in mode 1, we try and use all of those addresses and they are therefore revealed. In mode 2, we use only a specific set of addresses or resolver or turn servers, and those are therefore revealed. And in 3 and 4, we provide the APIs for other things. Because this relationship between the two kinds of information just isn't there. And I believe that what Alyssa was saying earlier when I finally understood it was, if you're on a chat server and playing Omegle or chat roulette or sex camming or whatever, you may very well be willing to show somebody your face or your genitals and not be willing to let them know that you're in the dorm room three blocks away, right? It's a very different thing. And if you try to relate them, you're going to always be in this muddy moment. And I think not trying to relate them and simply exposing in the modes what will happen is fundamentally better off. So I would personally rip this all out.
So Ted, the document does specify exactly what happens in
Exactly,
each
but
mode.
it doesn't need to do this as well.
But, okay, so at some point in, well, at least the document tries to say, here's what the default ought to be. And are you proposing that we walk back that notion of having a default? Or
No. And I still think the default you have is fine. But I am trying to say that trying to figure out what the default permission is for the network location related pieces of privacy sensitive information from the privacy sensitivity of the media is the wrong analysis to make.
Okay, I still don't sort of understand how we can have a default and not really consider that question. And this is how we ended up here. It's because we didn't really have a strong signal we could use, and this was the strongest signal. And as Eric pointed out, this covers.
Alyssa Cooper, so I agree with everything Ted said. I think the point is, do not justify your default based on tying these two notions together. You just have to pick a default. That's it. Don't justify it based on some relationship that doesn't exist. Just pick.
And you can say that the default is being picked because in a common case, we prefer network latency advantage over privacy, and that the non-common cases make other choices, and that's enough.
So, okay, I mean, let me take another shot at this. Say we said that we like mode 1 because it provides these the latency advantages, but it also is behind at least some consent rather than zero consent, which is really the drive-by case. I'm like, is that going too far? I mean, I would be happy if, I mean, that would basically be returning the text that was more similar to the original text, except striking the whole, sort of rationale about, well, it's more sensitive. It would basically be the old text, minus the sort of bold-faced statement almost.
If nobody believes that there's any reasonable way to obtain informed consent about this, then you shouldn't say anything about consent. And I don't think, I mean, other than Mo, who just got up here and said that, I don't think anybody actually believes that you can feasibly explain this to someone in this context and have them agree to it and have it be meaningful.
I mean, I do agree. I don't think there's a question you can put in front of users and get a reasonable response to.
So then they're not consenting to anything that is meaningful. That's not a good practice to
But so let me frame it a
hide
different way.
behind.
I mean, the user is placing trust into the application by consenting to allow them to have access to their camera. And you can certainly say that, a site that has, explicit trust of some sort from the user, it should be in a more privileged state than that one has no trust.
But that devolves back to this notion that these things are related, and they're not.
It seems like of the various, we consider various options, and this was the least bad option. And, I think it's also a very workable option. We actually saw, drive-by usage of harvesting go down substantially in Chrome once we actually did this. So I feel like, if we look at this too carefully, we may actually be kind of overanalyzing it and missing kind of like the fact that it's actually solving the core problem here. I mean,
So the argument isn't change the default. The argument is get rid of the false rationale for the default that's written in the document. That's it.
okay.
Okay?
Not quite on the same page with Alyssa. Okay, so modes 3 and 4 are great. You get into them with your SPRT requests, and we're only talking about the mode 1 or mode 0 and whether what type of permission prompt might move you to those.
Right, and what's the default behavior is the core question.
1 or 2?
Right.
Okay, sorry. Oh, sorry. The other slides are drafts. They're numbered differently. I understand why I'm confused now. Okay, so 1 or 2. So now for applications, particularly ones that are like a chat application or peer-to-peer application that don't have any audio or video involved at all, I mean, there is real costs of this requiring this permission. Maybe they'll just ask for it and people will not grant it because it'll just be creepy that your IM application is asking for access to your camera. So there is impact on doing that. So this is one of the things that I've wondered about on this is we're trying to solve a problem which, because we can't, I mean, if we could explain network location in the prompt, and the words network location might work. You're granting camera, mic, and network location. That's three different things, one thing. Or location. I'd be interested to see someone really dig in deep and see whether actually users could comprehend that as a thing. But if we're not doing that, we're not protecting it all from the original problem that drove us to this. We're basically just punting on it. And at the same time, we made the situation worse for a whole bunch of applications than where it was 6 months ago. And so I'm just not sure that's a good privacy trade-off on that. And I don't know where we can go on that, but I think we need to do it. Now, if we are solving the problem that we thought we were solving of this location stuff, then it'd be fine. But I don't see how, if we don't mention anything about that in the prompt, how we'd possibly be solving that.
Martin Thompson, I think I agree with what Alyssa said on this one. We should just rip out any talk of what it takes to get from 2 to 3 to 4 to 1 and let the browsers work that out at this point. I can't see anything. I got up though to object to the idea that trust is fungible. The idea that you've given them you trust someone to access a particular microphone has no bearing whatsoever on whether you trust them with your location or anything else. I think that's an important thing to get drummed into people's heads.
Okay. That seems like a hard statement to, really fully support. That something that you've invested some amount of trust into, not necessarily in all cases, but sort of on the aggregate would probably be, have a higher reputation than something that has not been trusted.
Oh, please.
Yeah, I shouldn't really respond to that, but I will. No. The obvious counter argument there is something I shouldn't say. That's all the example was seen, although contrived as they are, sort of run counter to that. If I think that I can control this permission that I've given you to my video camera that points at the wall and never ever points at anything else, or one that has a bit of tape over the top of it, that's very different to giving access to surprisingly something else.
Sure, that's true, but that's a cherry-picked case. I mean, in the aggregate form, I think that the whole basis of this whole.
I don't buy that. I think we'll just disagree on that point.
Okay. So I'm tired. I'm sure you're tired. So let's see if we can close this. So I think there seems to be widespread agreement that the technical design proposal, that the following statements are okay. Namely, that browsers should be allowed to go into mode 1 if they do this user consent. Even the camera microphone, namely this user interaction. It may be the case that browsers should also be allowed to go into mode 1 without doing that, or not. So I guess the primary purpose, as far as I can tell, of this material here that we're debating is two things. One, to say what browsers can and cannot do, if necessary, and the second is to rationalize why we might say they can and cannot do it. My sense is that the people in the room would largely be okay saying essentially nothing here. Or either giving browsers direction to do what they wanted, or alternately saying that browsers, might consider a user interaction prior to giving access to mode 1. Do you think we need to say something stronger than that, or do you just think? What is the normative force of what you're trying to get out of here? Or you just think people are wrong, and so you want to argue with them, which isn't unreasonable at all, since I do that all the time.
That's a really good point. I mean, I think to some extent this will come back to the RFC 2119 discussion that we're going to have later in this document of what is exactly this document, which was originally intended as a best practices document and now is being sort of recast as a standards track document, in which case this actually does have normative force. So like, let's assume for right now that this is standards track and we'll have normative force. Like, what should this actually say? You know, I guess we have two options. One where we say, like, we think that this, you know, the algorithm sort of explained here, like the consent that would be derived from like the get user media permission should in fact be used as a hint to, you know, engage mode 1 instead of mode 2, where we should say that no, we make no explicit recommendation. You might want to consider this, but basically it's left up to the browser's full discretion to decide. And you know, with whatever amount of text we wanted to say, we like wrestled with this issue at length, and like here's how we arrived at this conclusion, or not. Yeah. So like those 2 points, as you say, I think are separate. Like I sort of do lean on the side of including the rationale for posterity, but like I'm certainly open to like, you know, precedent on these sort of decisions.
Sure, yeah. I guess I would be honestly happy either with leaving browsers at discretion or not leaving browsers at discretion. One thing maybe I'd suggest that might make people feel better about this would be that we talked earlier about how much of the benefit of this is not that the user is consenting directly, but that the user has to be in the design loop, has to be in their interaction loop, or it doesn't happen, right? Right. And so perhaps one way to split the difference, and way to make people happier, would be not to talk about comparative levels of risk, but to say that browsers are required or encouraged or whatever to build their interfaces in such a way that it is not possible for JavaScript to enter mode 1 without some direct user interaction with the browser, that other than simply entering the system. Especially interaction. I don't want to wordsmith it, but the point being that would mean that any dialog whatsoever was acceptable, even if it said nothing, even if it said click here, or, you know, even if it came out of the Chrome and said click here, it'd be okay. Right. And maybe that would satisfy people to know the drive-by while avoiding this sort of what I kind of consider hair splitting about what the sort of bigger implications are of various kinds of consent.
Right.
Right. So,
We got 4 minutes, so I got to clip the line at the end of Martin.
yeah, so I mean, that basically seems to me like a recasting of this text here, or the text that was on the slide. And I would be totally fine with that. But I'm not sure I have a good sense from the room of whether people prefer that, or they prefer basically, you know, throwing up hands and saying, here's something you might want to consider, and you know, basically punting it up the stack to W3C.
I'm going to take my slot. I think I'd like to retain some ability to have browser discretion on this point. We may discover that there are better ways to acquire signals necessary to move us from 2 to 1. And it may be that we decide not to do this sort of thing. I want to avoid the prescription in the document as it stands, and I want to avoid the implications of that prescription, which I think are probably the most worrisome.
Okay.
So these things.
So with Ecker's proposal,
Ecker's proposal is fine.
The browser should at least make sure that it has some consent from.
Yeah.
Right, and then the details of that can be left to the.
Maybe with some sort of weasel words around it, so that we, you know, might decide that direct interaction at that point in time is not an appropriate signal because we find some other signals. But
okay, that sounds great to me. So that would leave the remaining question of rationale. Do we include rationale or not in this document?
The point being, I think that we should be gating access to 1 as much as possible.
Sure.
We actually cut the line.
All right.
We have some more stuff.
we have
Okay.
like 2 minutes. So.
Going to be the hardest.
Yeah. We may have to pick this
Well, actually, I expected that to be like the time we spent the most time on. So like that was actually fine. Do we have time at the end to kind of resolve any sort of or find consensus on this?
We are running out of time quickly. We'll probably have to do that on Friday.
Okay. All right. So moving on to proxies then. Hopefully it's being less contentious. Adam mentioned that the forced proxy mode was previously called forced TCP and proxy for historical reasons. There could also be UDP proxies, and in fact, this document considers specifically, return proxies and how they might work. That was absent from the initial version. Basically, these proxies behave a little bit differently than TCP proxies in terms of how they interact with the modes. In addition to the fact that they have fewer performance issues, and therefore, use of a proxy is not necessarily a big deal when you actually have a return proxy in place. Probably the most interesting thing is that mode 3 provides most of the benefits that you would want when you're using a return proxy, because the proxy would still be used for your traffic. You don't need to actually all the way go to mode 4, to actually force use of the proxy. And I'll show this in some diagrams. Next slide. Okay, so this is how, imagine a network where there's no sort of firewall blocking traffic to the outside, and there is a an HTTPS proxy available on the network. In mode 2, which is the restricted gathering plus the host candidate, you'll still just take the UDP path to your clients, because that's by far like the best path for media traffic. Similarly for mode 3, except in the case where you have a internal client you want to talk to, you're going to end up actually hairpinning that traffic either through your NAT or through your application turn server, because you won't have that local address that you can use to talk to that internal client. But the only time the traffic actually goes to the proxy is in mode 4, where you actually say force the proxy. Obviously, everything is different here. If the application firewall, or sorry, the enterprise firewall blocks direct UDP out, then everything will have to funnel through the app turn server and the proxy. But the key thing is that for proxies that are not being used in conjunction with the firewall, the only way you actually get traffic funneling through the proxy and following the same path as HTTP traffic is in mode 4. Next slide. So now we can consider the case of the return proxy behavior. And just like in mode 2, you can go direct. And this seems like the kind of thing you would want, so that you can have direct connections between clients that are both inside the same firewall. But in mode 3, we would want to use, like when you have the case where you only want to use, give out the address that really outside people are already seeing, which is the intent of mode 3. Here, we would actually want to use the return proxy. And since there's no internal candidates in mode 3, there's no local candidates being exchanged, connections between local candidates would in fact use the return proxy. And of course, in the forced proxy case, the traffic will actually go through the return proxy as well. So, if you compare between this slide and the previous slide, you'll see that the restricted gathering thing is a little bit different, in which case the return proxy will actually be used for the, inside the firewall case.
All right.
Next slide. So moving along, this came up on the mailing list. What do the words must and should mean in lowercase, which this document uses largely because I hadn't really taken the time to consider exactly how a best common practices document should be written, which spawned a very large discussion across the IETF mailing list, which came to, I think, the conclusion that must and lowercase must actually do mean different things, which in some ways is orthogonal to what is the ultimate fate of this document. And the two questions to be considered here are, is this a standards track document or not? And if it's a standards track document, shouldn't it be prescriptive by using 2119 language about the recommendations that it makes? Harold proposes that yes, it should be standards track, similar to like the audio and video requirements, and it ought to actually use 2119 language. And some examples, one particular example that was given was the topic we've discussed ad nauseum around permission granting, ought to be made into 2119 language.
So before we take the line, I'm going to point out that the meeting actually is now running over time, so you're missing your beverage break. But I have a question for our illustrious area director. So illustrious area director, given that this could have been part of JSEP had we not wanted to be able to rev it independently, are you okay with this being a standards track document?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anybody in the audience who wishes to go against the word of our illustrious area director and our former IETF chair that this is an appropriate standards track document? Okay, nobody leapt to the microphone who hadn't already left the room. Sure, I may have cast that slightly badly, but we'll ask on the mailing list again. Given the previous discussion on consent, and the fact that,
let's not read too much into these particular examples, given that.
I think that the right thing for us to do is to ask the author to take into account the obvious consensus to move this to standards track and more prescriptive language as a result, and to come up with language for us to consider in a pull request on Friday or on the mailing list. Is everybody okay with that?
Yeah, and I just want to point out, Justin, I mean, even if we never were prescriptive about which mode to use when, and we just defined what the modes were and some other document specified those, it'd still be perfectly reasonable to have the standard tracks document. So
Sure,
that's an independent decision. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's it. Next, anything?
I don't believe there is a next slide.
Oh, yeah, so.
Yeah, sorry. Definitely, they'll be publishing a new version at some point. So we will talk to Justin offline about whether we might hope for a quick pull request on this most recent slide before Friday. Otherwise, it will happen on the mailing list. Sorry for keeping you overtime. Please stick around for Friday. More fun then.